evening, everyone. My name is Rick Chess. I direct the creative writing program here at UNCA, and I'm really happy to welcome you to what I know is going to be an extraordinary reading by Cathy Smith Bowers. Before we turn to the formal introduction, and before I introduce the real introducers, I want to let you know about two other events that are happening this semester, creative writing events that are happening this semester. The first is that on Sunday, November 21st at, I think, 3 p.m., somewhere in that vicinity, in the Laurel Forum, the seniors, graduating seniors in creative writing are going to be reading excerpts from their senior theses. The senior readings are always one of the most exciting events of the year here at UNCA, and so I urge you to come out and hear what our graduating students have been up to with their own original poetry, prose, fiction, nonfiction, and plays. That's Sunday afternoon, November 21st, the Sunday before Thanksgiving. And then, if you really want to fill that particular weekend with interesting literary activities, literary and mathematical activities, as it turns out, I encourage you to come to what we hope is going to be our first annual conference on constrained poetry. It's a conference jointly sponsored by the Math Department and by the Creative Writing Program. It's in honor of the 50th anniversary of the creation of a movement called Oulipo, Organization for Potential Literature. It was an organization founded in Paris by a group of mathematicians, poets, fiction writers, and philosophers. They created extraordinarily elegant constraints for writing both poetry and prose original works, as well as for rewriting existing works. And so beginning on Friday night, November 19th, and then throughout the day on Saturday, November 20th, we'll be offering talks, readings, workshops. The conference, in fact, will conclude with a reading of works that were created during the conference itself. So that's Friday night, November 19th, and Saturday, November 20th. There's a flyer and a program for the conference on the back table where Malaprops once again is generously set up to support yet another literary event. That reminds me that I need to tell you that at least, 4 of Cathy Smith Bowers' books are available, thanks to Malaprops, for purchase and for signing following this evening's reading. One other thing that I want to announce is that the Literature Club, UNCA's Literature Club, is sponsoring a reception following the reading, so there'll be some good food, get some books, have good conversation with Cathy Smith Bowers and anybody else here who seems of interest to you over the course of the evening. Finally, I think this is my last announcement. I should say that we're recording this evening's reading, which will be followed by a Q&A. We're recording it, and it will be aired on Asheville Educational Television at some point in the not-too-distant future. This means that when you would like to ask Cathy Smith Bowers a question after the reading, you should come up to one of the 2 microphones in either aisle so that your question will also be recorded clearly for the future broadcast. So now I'd like to call on 2 of the students in Senior Seminar in Creative Writing, Christina Ayers and Sally Parrish, who have generously decided and agreed to introduce Cathy Smith Bowers. I guess just one last thing before I call on them. I first met Cathy Smith Bowers when I had the fortunate opportunity to teach at the low residency MFA program at Queens College. And I remember both times where I saw her at work, once at her reading when she read the minute poems that she had been working on, and secondly, when I saw her teach her class, I was absolutely blown away by what an amazing writer and teacher she is. And ever since then, I've been a big fan of her work, and I'm really happy that she is with us tonight. But now I'd like to call on Sally Parrish and Christina Ayers, who will do the official introduction.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for an evening of poetry from North Carolina's own Poet Laureate, Cathy Smith Bowers. I would like to thank UNCA's Creative Writing Program, the Literature Club, and the PB Paris Fund for Visiting Writers for helping to make this evening possible. Cathy Smith Bowers was appointed Poet Laureate by Governor Bev Perdue earlier this year, and during her career, she has received many awards and honors, including the General Electric Award for Younger Writers, a South Carolina Poetry Fellowship, a South Carolina Fiction Project Award, she has received the Queen's University 2002 J.B. Fuqua Distinguished Teacher Award and the Gilbert Chapel Distinguished Poet Award in 2006 and 2007 from the North Carolina Poetry Society.
Cathy Smith Bowers' poetry has been included in many prominent publications such as Poetry, Atlantic Monthly, the Georgia Review, the Kenyon Review, and Asheville's own Asheville Poetry Review. She is the author of 4 collections of poetry: The Love That Ended Yesterday in Texas, Traveling in Time of Danger, A Book of Minutes, and most recently, The Candle I Hold Up to See You. Cathy Smith Bowers currently teaches at the MFA program at Queens College. She's also on the faculty at the UNCA's Great Smokies Writers Program and Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. She also participates in Laureate's Radio Hour, which airs every 3rd Sunday of the month on Asheville FM radio.
Cathy Smith Bowers' work covers a broad range of subjects, from spirituality, family, and loss, to the love of language she inherited from her parents. She has said that her goal is to shine a light on a moment of intensity. She's a master at achieving this intensity with her courage, compassion, subtle, surprising humor, and wordplay.
Cathy Smith Bowers writes primarily in free verse, yet in her second most recent collection of poetry, she composed in the minute form, a stanzaic syllabic form incorporating rhymed couplets. In The Candle I Hold Up to See You, she has returned to free verse. Today, as many poets lean toward fragmented, nonlinear work, Bowers has remained true to the narrative. In her own words, she likes to think of a poem as a river of spirit, and every once in a while there comes a current of intellect. Please join me in welcoming North Carolina's Poet Laureate, Cathy Smith Bowers.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Rick, for inviting me. I'm as huge a fan of yours, your poetry, and your teaching as you are of mine. Thank y'all for coming. It's an honor to be here. What I'll do is just begin with my newest book and then just kind of work my way backwards. And if there's, I think sometimes, I've thought before it would be really neat, because Christina made a request that I read a poem out of this book, which I will be happy to grant. But I've always thought it would be really neat just to do a reading where you just simply ask for a request, except then there's the terror that nobody would request anything. So I'm not going to chance that. But anyway, if anybody would, like to make a request, I would be delighted to honor that. So I'm going to start with this newest book, The Candle I Hold Up to See You. And where's that little clock you said was up here? Oh, okay, great. Oop, all right. I can actually put it right here. Thank you. The title of this book comes from an Alan Shapiro poem. Do any of you guys know the work of Alan Shapiro? He is a marvelous North Carolina poet who teaches, I believe still teaches at Chapel Hill. Do you know, Rick? I was reading his work and was in the process of compiling this book, and I came across a poem called Turn. And he has this sentence in there, this line, "Speech is the candle I hold up to see you." Speech is the candle I hold up to see you. So it just seemed to be the perfect epigraph for the book and a title, The Candle I Hold Up to See You. So really the subject of this book is language itself, the human attempt to articulate emotion, thought, or just information to another human being. So I'm going to begin with some of the poems that are very obviously inspired by language. And this particular, this is actually the first poem in the second section of the book. And this poem is called Language, A Sentimental Education. And both of my parents loved language, and even though they weren't educated people. And my mother especially, when you're getting old enough, when you're little and your parents are teaching you names for your private parts, and of course you don't get the scientific name or the biological name. You get things like belly button, right? Well, my mother, that wasn't good enough. That wasn't original enough for my mother. So I was in first grade before I learned that this part of the anatomy was not called the boll weevil. And so this poem recounts that that moment of intensity when I found out that this was not the boll weevil. Language, a sentimental education. How it makes and breaks you, that tenuous stringing together of letters and sounds, mean and amen, casual and casualty, good and God and dog. How it can turn on you, the way my first grade teacher's eyes bulged in disbelief the day I ran crying to her, tattling on the snot-nosed boy who had poked me in my boll weevil with his pencil. I can feel the mortification of that moment still, the class tumbling into hysterics, collapsing among the jacks and pickup sticks as I lifted my shirt for her to see, the whirls of my primordial wound reddening where his eraser had gone. It's time, my mother said, as I recounted later the sequence of events. Time, she said, and began the inevitable cleansing, slow evacuation of the beautiful rhetoric of metaphor she had 6 years blessed me with. That day, she gave me navel, the next, vagina and urinate, words that could take me anywhere, help me, she assured, disappear into any crowd. Good dog. And some of the poems in this book are simply taking a look at a single word and holding that word up to, look at it in all of its angles. And I'm especially interested in words that don't sound, their sounds do not match up with the meanings of the words. For instance, the word pulchritude. Right? Pulchritude, the ugliest word I've ever heard, which means what? Beauty. Now explain that one to me. On the opposite side of that are those beautiful words that mean not so beautiful things. So this next poem is called Abattoir. Abattoir. And if you don't know what an abattoir is, you will by the time I finish this poem. Abattoir. The first time I heard the word, I imagined some faraway room too lavish and exotic for the likes of me. mounds of velvet pillows, beds carved and fluffed and canopied, fringed shades to ease the blinding noonday sun. In 7th grade, I was taught to get to the root of things, all the whars of our daily lives waiting to be deciphered. Boudoir, armoire, reservoir, places where things of value might safely be kept. Chambers for dreaming ladies, wardrobes lush with dresses, hats, and gowns, walled pools of clean, fresh water to quench the browning crops. But when that lost and lovely word came floating back to me, I was shocked to learn there was also a place for misery and pain. For the once bright creatures prodded down the line, wide-eyed, mewling, blinking still, though the slashed carotid, the quick, sure current of the stunning rod had promised otherwise. How beautiful it had sounded to me then. Abattoir, abattoir, abattoir. A place, had I been invited, I might have stepped lightly in. And one of the things I've found myself doing too in this particular section was, again, recounting moments when a misinterpretation of a word might land you on a psychiatrist's couch for the next 30 years. So I was almost 40 years old before I learned that there was more than one kind of frog. That I thought that a frog was this little bumpy green creature that you found out in creeks and hopping along the wet grass. And so this poem recounts a terrifying moment in my young life that I carried with me until I was about 40 years old. So this poem is called, and that moment that, in case there are some of you who don't know that there's this thing that you can put at the bottom of a vase to stick the stems of flowers in that's also called a frog. Okay. I wish I had known that in 6th grade. And this is also during my whole grammar school years, and I think it's pretty much like this still, I had one teacher for the whole day. Is that what grammar school is still like? And then when I went to the 6th grade, because the principal of the grammar school also was one of the teachers. He taught science. So because he was also the principal and had other duties, another teacher drove for the second half of the day to teach us our other classes. And she came from the other side of the tracks, the good side of the tracks. And so we sort of, held her in such high regard that we could not believe that she had been all morning with those kids from the other side of the tracks. So this poem is called Where's My Frog? We worshiped her, Mrs. King, who was ours for only half the day that year. 6th grade, our sights on junior high, and all those kids from the good side of the tracks she gave her mornings to, before driving to our dingy neighborhood for history and language arts. We would have done anything for her, as if having only half rendered her more valuable. The way we cherished our always absent fathers, our mothers dull in their faded aprons and always tired, the most wretched of commodities being wholly ours. One day, she motioned me to her desk, Lavon Dees, too, a girl from up the street who had failed 2 grades, anathema to all the other teachers whose lessons she had slumbered through. The class was reading to themselves, heads bent quiet above the hard and colored history of our state. We trembled on our way, the wood beneath our soles creaking with every step that delivered us to the vase she had lifted from her desk, huge globe filled fresh each Monday with peonies and mums, blossoms of magnolia that rotted through the week as the tests and essays grew, an ominous Mount Sinai next to them. We couldn't believe she had chosen us to deliver safely down the hall into the girls' restroom that vase like the Holy Grail we had learned about at Saturday matinee, the sole purpose of our common life now realized. In the restroom, the sun poured through like the light in the painting my mother had got with green stamps. Jesus offering up his thorn-encrusted heart, the eyes you could not escape no matter where you sat. Into the rusty can we flung the browning petals, their stems now limp, leaves curled and brittling like the husks of cicadas that signaled summer's end, then into the nearest stall to flush beyond oblivion the swampy dregs. When we eased into her hands the empty vase, scrubbed and polished to an astral sheen, our one breath stopped, hungry for the smallest wafer of her gratitude, stunned at what we got instead, the slitted eye, stuck frown of her face peering deep inside, those 3 bleak words, "Where's my frog?" Our knees went soft, the folds of our single brain calling back the mysterious kerplunk we had heard at the bottom of the commode just as I pressed the lever. The rest of that whole year, we suffered her disdain, we who had killed her beloved pet, the one she brought with her each Monday to bask in the still primordial waters of that week's blooms. Dark Lethe, my dreams would conjure, childhood's defining act I would bear into the purgatory of junior high Lavon decided to forego. Then high school and on to college, to the man I would finally marry, who years later, beneath the whirring fan of an antique shop, would lift from its shelf a small glass orb, the likes of which I'd never seen, its surface a conglomeration of tiny holes. "And look," he would say as he handed it to me, "a frog. I haven't seen one in years." I don't know what happened to Lavon. She's probably a hopeless alcoholic by now. When I graduated from Winthrop at the age of 21, I went back to the high school I'd graduated from to teach. And, dreamed, of course, those of us who major in English, we love literature, we love language, and so we think we're going to go and be in a classroom and talk about literature. And then I learned that I got to teach 5 level 3 classes of seniors. They were actually level 1, the brightest, level 2, the mediums, and level 3 the lowest. And they knew, they were told, they were designated level 1, 2, 3. They even had different books. I mean, it was like you could see a level 3 book in a student's hand, and it was as if it were glowing or something. But so I went back to teach that year, and my first day of school, I taught everything I knew. And when the bell rang at the end of the day, the students fled. And I put my head down on my desk and I said, oh shit, because I saw 35 more years looming ahead of me, and I had just taught everything I knew. And one of the things that I knew that day was the conjugations of the two verbs hang, okay? The one that means to hang laundry, which has the three principal parts of hang, hung, hung, and then the other hang, which means to execute, the three principal parts being hang, hanged, hanged, okay? First year teacher. During an impassioned lecture on the three principal parts of hang and hang, I turned from my grainy etchings across the board, and in the voice of a would-be pundit whose moment had finally come, said, "Please remember, class, men cannot be hung." The laughter began a ripple down the aisle. A prurient note passed from desk to desk until the entire class let loose a roar. When they finally gained composure, someone said, "Couldn't it just be you've had bad luck with men?" Oh. How anybody survives it, I don't know. And another language poem. When I first started, I always knew I wanted to be a poet. My parents loved language, as I said, and loved metaphor and loved rhyme and meter and all that good stuff. And so when I started writing poems, my poems were a lot like I was trying to be like Edgar Allan Poe and being pretty successful at it too. And all of my poems were set in England in the 1800s. And so I wrote this poem once, and it had this line that I just thought was the greatest line of poetry ever written, and it was, "Where haunts the ghost after the house is gone? Where haunts the ghost after the house is gone?" I thought that was so deep. And then the other line in this same poem was, "Where runs the girl after the woman's come?" Well, I still think those are great lines. It's just we don't talk like that, So this poem is called, I couldn't get away, even though I continued to love those lines, I couldn't get away with writing a poem with the line, "Where haunts the ghost after the house is gone?" So I wrote a poem about trying to write a poem without, so I won anyway. So this poem could also be a cautionary tale for any creative writing teachers among you. It's called Syntax. "Where haunts the ghost after the house is gone?" I once wrote. First line of my first poem in my first creative writing class. I'd been reading Byron, Keats, and Shelley, lots of Poe. Loved how the cadence of their words fit the morass my life had fallen to. I had stayed up all night counting stressed and unstressed syllables, my mother's weeping through the door of her shut room, echoing the metrics of my worried words. It was the year our family blew apart. My mother, brothers, and sisters and I fleeing in the push-button Rambler with no reverse, and Uncle had taught me to drive. I loved that poem, finally knew how words the broken and bereft could alchemize. Couldn't wait to get to class, could hear already in my mind that teacher's praise. When it came my turn to read, the paper trembled in my hand, my soft voice cracked. Years passed before I reached the final word, before she took the glasses from her nose and cocked her head. "You've skewed your syntax up," was all she said. I remember nothing else about her class. That spring, her house burned down. She died inside. Where haunts the ghost after the house is gone? I had several alibis. Okay, one more from this. My mantra is that I always begin with what I call an abiding image. My students out there how many times have you heard me say abiding image rather than an idea? And so I just begin with an abiding image, an image that has hooked me and has been hanging on, often being pushed down into the unconscious for months, years, decades. And then I just write into the mystery of that image. And this particular image I brought home with me from a trip to, it was a return trip from actually a business trip in Roanoke. And so there was this, my husband and I were sitting in the little, very close little cozy pub in the inn where we were staying, and this poem is about the couple sitting at the next table, and it's called The Napkin. One night in a pub on the outskirts of Roanoke, I sat with my husband at a table lit only by the candles' mute flickering and the small waning moons of our drinks. I was writing in my journal, journaling a journey soon coming to its end, when suddenly, at the table to our left, a soft commotion of arms and hands. I looked at my husband, lost in some lost moment of the now lost day, and then at him, at them, a subtle peripheral glance I had long ago perfected. I could easily have touched them. They were that close, lovers perhaps, signing to each other their tongueless words. Each in turn, their hands rose, bright wings above the flame's dim corona, secret negotiations of finger and thumb. I was stunned to see how beautiful he was, as if in the convoluted logic of my mind, those devoid of sound and speech must too be devoid of loveliness. I could see the silvery sheen of her nails, glimmer of bracelets and rings as they mounted the air, lifting then falling, strafing the crumbed and waxy landscape of the table below. When they left, something fluttered to the floor, the napkin they had at intervals been scribbling on, passing back and forth, the sweet lexicon of their hands eluding even them. My husband reached down, handed it to me. Slowly I began to read, unfolding like lingerie the delicate layers, each boneless, fleshless syllable naked before my eyes. She should be talking to him, it said, not writing in that book. Poor guy. He looks so lonely. Okay, well, you probably noticed that these poems, some of these poems went on and on and on and on and on for 2, 3, and 4 pages. Well, this was what happened after I spent 4 years writing in a form called the Minute, which limited me to 60 syllables per poem. And this book was so strange and so different. This is my 3rd book, actually. It was so strange that I said, I got to write a preface to explain to my readers what happened to me. And I actually started working in this little form after my beautiful youngest brother died of AIDS in 1997. And he was, there were 6 of us in the family, and he was the absolute love of our lives. His doctors considered him a miracle because they think that he had had the virus for 14 years, and he took such great care of himself that, even he didn't even start getting sick until that last year. We didn't even know. He kept the fact that he did have the virus away from us until he started getting sick, and then he told us. He died in November, the day before Thanksgiving, 1997, and it was devastating. And so I didn't even go back. I was still with my undergraduates at Queens then, and I didn't even go back. We'd finished up. My students were working on their portfolios, and the head of my department, got them all organized and delivered the portfolios to me. So I finally made it through the spring semester, very depressed, clinically depressed, and didn't even want to be near words. It was what. My emotions were so raw, I didn't even want to write. But after graduation in May, I went out to Oklahoma City to do workshops and to give a reading at a writers' conference. And I planned to stay several extra days, thinking maybe that, being out there in the quiet and the school year being over, I could get back into writing. And so while I was at another woman's presentation, she started reading these short little poems that were just so tight and so vivid that I was really drawn to them. So she stopped her reading at one point and asked, would anyone like to know how to write in this form? It's a form called the Minute. And the form has, so as she was telling somebody how, telling the audience how to write, I just jotted down this structure. And I got up on Sunday morning, the conference was over, and I knew I had to write. So I said, maybe this little tight structure will be a safe container for me just to help me get back into writing, and then I'll go back to free verse. 4 years later, I was still writing in this form. So the first poems that I wrote in this little form were poems about my brother's illness and his death. And the book, since the title, A Book of Minutes, sort of echoes the Book of Hours, I decided to have 8 sections, just like the prayer sections, beginning with matins, morning prayers, going all the way through Compline to Vespers, and then to, Compline is the last, isn't it? Okay, Compline is the last. So the poems that I wrote about my brother ended up being the penultimate section called Vespers or evening prayers. So I'll read you some of the poems from the little section that were some of the first poems that I wrote. And my brother lived with his partner Bill out in Sausalito. And this first little poem shines a light on the first plane trip my two sisters and I took to go visit him after we found out that he was sick. 3 otherwise healthy women. And, you know, if it's not bad enough to limit the poem to only 60 syllables, it's also in rhymed couplets, AABB, you know, that kind of. What poets have done is they've managed to legitimize obsessive-compulsive disorder, right? So this first little poem in this section, Vespers, is called Flying to Sausalito with My Sisters. In a cloud above the Badlands, Rosie's right hand newly bandaged. Beside her, rage disguised, tiny carcinoma grazing Trisha's wrist. Under my arm, the knot I've just discovered. Our bodies' deep cargo of grief en route to our dying brother. Labor Day. Morning's IV done, all his pills. He turns to Bill's gift of melon, icy sweet chunks of honeydew brought home from the local deli. I watch each bite he takes, then wipe his chin. Unbelievable, he says, and lifts a bite to me. Says, here, just taste this. So you see how this little form can really, it's a wonderful way to shine a light on a single moment of intensity. And that's what I was trying to do, capture every little moment that I had with my brother. When my mother speaks of loneliness. When my mother speaks of loneliness, I offer to bring her some books. The new Updike and Oscar Wilde she hasn't read. My brother is dead, her youngest, his ashes just settled in their urn. No, she turns to me and says, bring shame, the grapes of wrath, bring rain, the ones I've read before and loved. The trunk. I envied my dog that option, the rattan trunk chewed this morning to twig. All night I had warded off that dream, my brother alive once more, asking if I'd like to see the trick again. All night this, and beyond the wall, the gnashing of my dog's teeth. A very interesting thing happened after I had been working in this form for 3 years. I noticed I was writing silly, funny poems. And I thought, wow, yeah, because that's what, in general, you know, when we suffer a devastating loss, it's usually 3 years before we start, you know, feeling hope and joy in life, which I thought I never would again. You know, I was just going to bide my time. So this poem is one of those poems that I actually, you know, captured a moment that, or that I wrote when I was actually smiling again. And my brother used to love to tell this story. And he would all be together and he would say, do y'all remember when? And we knew what story was coming. And we'd start laughing, and he'd start laughing. And a story that should have taken like 3 seconds to tell would end up taking 30 minutes because he couldn't get it out. So this poem is called Torge. T-O-R-G-E, Torge. 3 years after your death, when I can smile once more, I recall the story you loved to tell about asking your grade school teacher to spell Torge for you. Torge? She asked in sheer bewilderment. Torge, you said again, like the prince rode towards the castle on a big white horse. So that's how we talk down in Lancaster, South Carolina. Torge, wrench these dishes, chimley, stuff like that. And I remember telling my mother, Mama, I want to be famous one day. And she'd say, honey, I'm sure you will. All right, Christina requested this one. This was also in my silly stage. This poem is called, now you have to listen closely, okay? It's subtle, deep and subtle. This poem is called How I Became an Existentialist. The year I got no Valentines, it was snowing deep outside. I'd probably walked 5 miles on cardboard soles. The boy behind me must have seen, tried hard to muffle the sound as he ripped his own big heart in two. The part he handed me said only, be. Get it? Be my Valentine. That's how I tell jokes, too. I have to go back and explain them. How was that, Christina? Okay, a couple more. I don't know. I'll take, anybody have a request out of yes, Ann? More? Okay, that's not in any of these. I'm sorry I don't have it. It'll be in my new and selected. But thank you for remembering that guzzle. What? Groceries. Okay, that's one I'd love to read. Thank you. Groceries. Well, my family broke apart, as you could, was alluded to in the poem syntax. Right when I was about between 17 and 18, and we found a little house across town. We snuck out while my father was at work, and we really went from poor to poorer. He was a mill worker, and he had become, such a harsh alcoholic that we were afraid to live in the same house with him. So we finally got away, and so we went from poor to poorer. But the thing that saved us in those earliest months was that I had a boyfriend who worked at the Piggly Wiggly. Now, in case I know that you know what the Piggly Wiggly is, but I have had people before say, "What's the Piggly Wiggly?" Okay, we all know the Piggly Wiggly is a grocery store, right? All right, good. So this poem is called Groceries. I had a boyfriend once after my mother and brothers and sisters and I fled my father's house, who worked at the Piggly Wiggly, where he stocked shelves on Fridays until midnight, then drove to my house to sneak me out, take me down to the tracks by the cotton mill, where he lifted me and the quilt I'd brought into an empty boxcar. All night, the wild thunder of looms, the roar of trains passing on adjacent tracks, hauling their difficult cargo. Cotton bales or rolls of muslin on their way to the bleachery to be whitened, patterned into stripes and checks, into still life gardens of wisteria and rose. And when the whistle signaled third shift free, he would lift me down again onto the gravel and take me home. If my mother ever knew, she didn't say. So glad in her new freedom, so grateful for the bags of damaged goods stolen from the stockroom and left on our kitchen table. slashed bags of rice and beans he had bandaged with masking tape, the label-less cans, the cereals and detergents in varying stages of destruction, plenty to get us through the week, and even some plums and cherries, tender and delicious, still whole inside the mutilated cans and floating in their own sweet juice. Anything else anybody can think of? Got about just a few more minutes. Thank you. Okay. So that'll take me back to the first one. Thank you, Christina. I still like this poem a lot. So this is the poem about the little girl my mother named me for. And many of you who have heard me read this poem know the story of how she was very proud of how she chose our names. And she said she thought about it for just a long time. She pondered different names. She asked herself, is this a name that this child will be ashamed of one day? Is it a name that somebody can turn into a funny nickname? And I'm sure if that song, what's the name of that song? What's that song? The name song? The Name Game. If it had been out while she was having her children, I'm sure she would have put our names to the test on that too. So it's a good test if you're thinking of something to name your child. There are certain names you would not want that child to have to carry around. So she used to tell us, go through the litany of how she had chosen our different names, and she would, say, well, I named you after a famous movie star. I named you after a famous athlete. I named you after St. Paul in the Bible. That was my baby brother. And then she'd look at me and say, and I named you after a little girl who died in an abandoned well. And I was a little confused, but I was obsessed with this story and obsessed with it, until I was way, out of college and out of, away from home. And my mother, I used to harass her to tell me more details, and she couldn't remember. She just remembered that it was that everybody, when this little girl fell into that well out in California, she said it was like the whole world stopped because it took them several days to get her out. And I even did research. I went to the Charlotte Observer, and looked in these old newspapers from that year and couldn't find anything. And then has it been 20 years now when the same thing happened to little Jessica, she lived in Texas, I believe. And the day that after they got her out, and the big headline was little Jessica safe, I opened up the Charlotte Observer, and somewhere tucked inside was a story. The headline read, "Drama Stirs Memories of Tragedy." And it was the story of this little girl, Cathy Fiscus, that my mother had named me for. All the details that I had been longing. One of the things that this story revealed was that the year that happened, it was the first year that people started getting televisions in their homes. Somebody down the street might have a television. It was that year. And it also said that the story that surrounding little Cathy Fiscus was the first event that people watched together as a nation, and it showed the impact that television was going to have. And some of you guys, I might need to remind you that the first televisions were black and white; they were not color. You do know that, right? I mean, you never can tell, guys. So this poem is called "Namesake," for Cathy Fiscus, 3, who died in an abandoned well the summer of 1949. From the face of the earth is how they put it when someone disappears. So all day your father paces among bulldozers and cranes, as your mother sits in the car muttering to the visor. I hang in my own mother's womb, little turtle, zeppelin of skin and marrow. The chipped ice she craves grinds in her teeth like pneumatic saws. And because television that summer will be the closest thing to miracle, she gives in to the sloppy recliner, to the window fans rattle and clack, to watch as hour by hour hope fails in black and white. Down there, you must have heard something queer, a scraping at earth, some ancient burrowing. And what word can name the descent of midgets armed with buckets and spades? You lived 2 days, your voice tamping at the surface, that one song rising now and then into the suspended mic. Then air, light, the blood hammering at the soft closure of my skull. They lifted me out, all slag and sediment, sludge of another life, and gave me your name. Thank you. And Christina, thank you for requesting that. That's a good one to end on. So, I borrowed these glasses. They work great. I'd be happy to hear any questions, answer if I can answer any.
I read some of your stuff earlier today for the first time, which I really love.
Thank you so much.
And it's great to hear the context of the writing, but I wonder how you balance that with just hearing it without the context. It seems to me that it's more universal when I don't know the context, and it narrows the impact for me. And how do I balance that?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are different schools of thought on that. There are poets who get up and think you should not say one word. They don't even want you to speak in your own tone of voice. They say you should read poems with no inflection so that only the words go out there. But my philosophy is this, that most of you people have not seen these poems. You didn't have them to look at. You may never see them again. So I feel that it's helpful if you're listening to something that you can't even look at, to have something to grab onto as you're hearing the poem. But I would hope, and I work really hard on my poems, I'd like to think that somebody could pick up one of my books, open the book to a certain page, read a poem, and would at least get on the surface level. There would be something about the poem that would move them, that would make them want to go back and read the poem again and again to see some of the more subtle things. But it's and also I agree with Ron Rash, who said that he talks a lot too when he's reading his poems. He says that a poem's just an excuse to tell a story anyway. So, the poems are what got me invited here. I just wanted to tell y'all some stories.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for reading some of my poems too.
What do you say to people who, when they hear a poem read out loud, feel they can't take it in and comprehend it the way they can comprehend it when they read it? How do you encourage someone to hear a poem?
Well, that is a good question, because one of the seminars that I teach at Queens in the low residency program is called How to Read a Poem. And so, I love what Robert Bly once said. And Robert Bly's been here too, hasn't he, Rick? He said, I heard him say once that when we hear a poem, we take it in here. But when we read it on the page, we take it in here. And I think our first experience of a poem should be here. I don't think we should worry about meaning in that first reading. I think that we should let the poem wash over us, that we should let our bodies experience the poem. And then if something moves us, that might be an indication that you might want to then look at it and read it from here and look more closely at the poem. If a poem moves me in any way, and I read a lot of poems that don't move me in any way, so I just go on with my life, but if a poem moves me, in any way, just like the music of the language, which is why I started reading Gerard Manley Hopkins. I didn't understand what the heck he was saying, but I just knew that language, it grabbed hold of me, and I would memorize his poems and recite those poems. And then after about 5 years of just reciting, I caught this morning's minion on, and I said, I wonder if that means anything. And I started working at it. So I would say and I do this with my students too. The first time I read a poem to them, I don't hand them a copy the first time I read it, just to try to get them to let it wash over them and experience the poem. And then you can think about, well, what does all of this mean later? So I think it's hard to sit and hear poems. I really do, because to me, a major thing that differentiates prose from poetry is the compression. In prose, we often hear that we have to learn to read between the lines. Well, in poetry, you've got to read between the words. But see, you guys don't have these poems to look at. So I would say just try to, train yourself if you're going to a reading to just sit there, take a few deep breaths and just let the poems wash over you and feel the poems. And then, if you like that particular poet's work, then, get them and look at them more closely to see some of the more subtle things that have been done. When I'm working with my students' manuscripts that I'm going to have to respond to and make observations and suggestions, I will not, the first time I read through them, I do not allow myself to have a pen or a pencil in my hand. Why? Because that pen or pencil means that I'm where? Up here. And I don't want to be up there when I read those poems for the first time. So, I'll just make myself get away from a pen or a pencil. It's different. I'm reading them for a different reason that first time. And then second, third readings, fourth, I'll start, looking more closely and maybe underlining things, circling things, putting question marks, writing notes about what I really love. And but that's how that's my way of making sure that at least the first reading of my students' poems I'm taking in here. And I will actually read them out loud too, even though I am looking at them on the page. I'll read them out loud, and I can do that because I'm usually at home. People won't think I'm too crazy. I hope that answered. Did that answer? Anything else?
So in the minute poems, so sometimes I was hearing the rhymes, and sometimes I wasn't hearing the rhymes, and then sometimes you read it as if you wanted me to hear the rhyme, like you kind of pushed the rhyme a little bit. I was wondering if you did that on purpose, and if that was something like the rhyme at that moment was meaningful to you or something like that?
Well, my guess, though, is that the rhyme at that moment was more obvious. It was, for instance, the way you soften the rhyme is is by, doing what's called enjambment. Instead of having the reader stop at the end of the line, you force the reader into the next line, so that the rhyme should be very, very subtle. What I would hope is that you might be, if I had not said, for instance, they rhymed, you might have been thinking, well, there's sort of something going on with the sound, and yet it's not, wine, spine, kind. So it's that enjambment that does that. But, every once in a while in these poems, I would have an end-stop line. So that's probably what you were hearing, a rhyme that came when I actually paused instead of moving on. But this, just very quick to going back to the one about my brother eating the melon. I won't spend much time on this, I promise. I know everybody. Okay, so here's the first line. Morning's IV done all his pills. He turns to Bill's gift of melon. Icy sweet chunks. See, chunks and melon, that's a rhyme. Yeah. And this is the point at which my undergraduates tell me I need a new rhyming dictionary. But yeah, that it's fun. It's a challenge to do that and to actually come up with a halfway decent poem, because as it is with a lot of fixed forms, you can really write some bad ones, So to do one that you would at least put in a book, that's pretty good, because I had a lot that did not go in this book. Anything else?
I'm wondering if and how writing in the minute form for so long affected your poetry when you did return to free verse.
Man, I said, by God, I am going to repeat words. I'm going to use as many syllables as I want. And I mean, even when I was reading The Napkin, did you notice that I was writing in my journal, journeying, a journey soon? It's like, Kathy, how many more times are you going to say journey? But I was just determined, I mean, it was like coming out of a box. So that's how these poems in the Candle got so long. But I used, after this book came out, I was giving a reading once, and this seemed logical to me. This is Kathy's brain. This is Kathy's brain on Prozac. That really. But it was a fascinating process. It really was. Anything else?
This might be a wonderful moment to conclude. I want to thank you for an amazing...
Thank you, Rick. Thank you all. Thank you, guys.
Suzette and Gilly and the members of the Lit Club to a reception, and there are books available, and I'm sure Kathy will be happy to answer questions individually, sign books. Thank you all for coming. Hope to see you at the Woolley Pope Conference and at the Senior Reading